the country, and happy lunchtime to the folks on the East Coast here. My name is Dwayne Barnes, responsible for engineering and technology here at RapidScale. And this month's technical webinar is really based on PCI compliance in the cloud and sort of what the main areas that the cloud service provider is responsible for, as well as the end user customer. So just some quick housekeeping items here. The session will be recorded. The benefit there is you can watch it later if you find yourself distracted throughout this webinar, or just want to go back and review some of the key topics later. This will be distributed to the partners as well as uploaded to our partner portal. If you have any questions or you don't know how to access the portal, you can always email our wonderful marketing team here at RapidScale at marketing@rapidscale.net. They will get you hooked up with access. Beyond this video being there, there's all sorts of other great content, as well as all of our past webinars that we've done. Questions that happen that come up through the presentation, don't hesitate to ask. There's a little raise my hand feature built in the GoToMeeting. You can pose that question through the chat window there. The marketing team and the other moderators behind the scenes will get those questions answered and responded to. And any questions that aren't answered through the chat, they'll throw at me here towards the end of the webinar during the Q&A session, and I'll attempt to answer those as best as I can. And anything I can't answer, well, we might have some bigger problems. No, I'm just kidding. So basically, we will follow up with you offline if anything that either we run out of time or just requires a more detailed response. And certainly, most of you know who your channel managers are. You can always follow up with them as well if anything comes out of this that you have some sort of epiphany where you might have an opportunity you want to share with us. So diving right in here. Most companies that are required to be PCI compliant at some level or another, according to Verizon's recent compliance report, 80% really aren't compliant. They're frequently finding gaps when they go through their audits that prevent them from being 100% compliant. A lot of that is just really due to them not knowing that there's certain criteria that they're not meeting, and a lot of it is they don't care until they have an issue, right? So a lot of people treat compliance as a checklist. You'll hear to things like, yeah, I just need a firewall to make sure I'm compliant, but they don't really follow up on it or figure out how it's being used or monitored. They're just checking a box to make that auditor happy. Of course, that works until they actually have a problem. But if you look at fast forward a year, only 29% of those compliance, or 29% of those companies that got the sign off by the auditor are still compliant a year later. And of course, no IT environment stays stagnant these days, with everything essentially being digital and paper records going away and all that sort of stuff. It's very hard to maintain compliance without following up on it more than once a year. A survey, again, found that 0% of these breach companies were found to be fully compliant, meaning even the Targets and JCPenney's of the world that have recently, even the Home Depots that have gone through major breaches, when the auditors came back in after that breach, they obviously found that, they were not compliant. So somewhere in their network, they had an open, wireless access point or something that caused the breach, right? And then you get to the kind of SMB market, right? Those small, mom and pop shops, or even just smaller, regional businesses. They're not really familiar with the major components of PCI. They just know they're accepting credit cards and they want them to work. They have no clue that there's 12 major requirements and that's contained within PCI that they need to actually adhere to. And just shy of 70% of consumers would be less inclined to do business with a breach organization, right? So Target certainly took a hit. They're probably the most widely known. Even your grandparents probably knew that Target was recently breached and probably avoided shopping there for a few months while they got their act together, right? And it took Target over a year to ship out new credit cards with the actual chip readers in them, as opposed to just the magnetic stripes. So it's not a easy feat for company to recover from a breach. Certainly not a less inexpensive one either. The average total cost of a data breach is $4 million, right? And that's obviously, you know, an average across a wide variety of industries and a wide variety of company sizes. I think the more important stat is up nearly 30% in the last 4 years. So that's pretty interesting number there. So the 4 million can mean a lot to a company or can mean nothing to a company the size of Target. But the increase in that cost of 30% is really the more impressive number there. So, and that's everything from lawsuits. You know, again, Target had to buy identity protection for every, you know, credit card customer for a year. You know, certainly lost data, but also lost revenue from just, you know, confidence, consumer confidence, right? So, you know, what exactly is PCI? And to further onto that, PCI DSS, which is really the full term there, right? So PCI is simply just payment card industry, right? So the industry got together. It was originally led by Visa. Since then, there's probably 25 or 30 member organizations now that contribute to what's called the data security standards for the payment card industry. So think of companies like JP Morgan and American Express and some large retailers are involved in that. But it's mostly banks and credit card companies that got together and said, you know what, we need to have a standard. We need to hold, you know, our merchants accountable, really, as well as holding themselves accountable. So there's really, it's just a set of requirements. And PCI is one of the few compliances that the merchant can actually shut the customer, or the customer being the business accepting credit cards, can turn them off for being non-compliant. Meaning you have, you know, 20 location smoothie shop, and all of a sudden the merchant gets notice from the auditor that you didn't pass your PCI audit. They can just turn off your credit card machine until you, you know, remediate those problems. Where HIPAA is not going to cause you to stop, you know, seeing patients, right? Outside of a gross negligence, you're going to keep seeing patients, and you're just going to pay the fine. Where PCI can literally put you out of business if you ignore it long enough. So again, it's designed to help facilitate a global adoption of kind of a consistent security profile for anybody accepting credit cards. There's requirements in there from, you know, security management, policy, procedures. So it's not all on the service provider or where the data is hosted. A lot of it is internal documentation. You know, do you have, you know, complex passwords for any employees that have, you know, access to that environment is one example. Certainly the architecture of how your network is designed and making sure that any data that does have personally identifiable information is protected as part of that. And a big part of it's software design. So it's not on neither the customer or the cloud provider. It's whatever software they're using that's accepting the credit cards. So any customer that takes credit cards, processes them, stores them, or transmits them to a payment processor falls under PCI. So these days, that's just about everybody. There's very few businesses that don't accept credit cards. Probably most of the people on this phone are associated with some sort of PCI compliance at some level, right? If you accept any kind of payment from a credit card, you would fall under there. Now, the good news is level 1 being the main kind of entry level is up to 50,000 transactions per year. So, you know, most companies these days are level 1, and that's the least stringent requirement. So the main objectives that PCI is organized in, you know, again, there's 12 requirements, as I mentioned earlier, but you can kind of loosely organize those 12 within kind of 6, you know, overall topics, you know. So the build and maintenance of a retail point-of-sale system. Now, not everybody has these, but think of that as the little Ingenico devices at, you know, at the Macy's, right? When you go there and you check out in line, you swipe your credit card, that's a POS system, right? Now, those are typically connected to a private network that transmits that data, you know, off to a third-party processor. But again, the basic design there is you can't just have that hooked up to your public Wi-Fi, right? So some of this is probably common sense for most of you guys, but if you think about people in retail, they're not IT folks, they're not network experts. They just plug the machine in and, you know, test it, it works, great, they're accepting credit cards, they never think twice about it. So protecting that cardholder data. Now the overwhelming majority of retail businesses, you know, again, outside of the Walmarts and Targets of the world, right? You know, the guy down the street that does dry cleaning, essentially, they're not actually storing the cardholder data, right? All they're doing is transmitting it securely in an encrypted manner, and, you know, at worst case, they're storing the last 4 digits of the card for simply identifying to the customer that, you know, on their receipt, that they can track that back to that person. But there are obviously big companies that store and mine that data, and they store it for future purchases as well. So those are the more bigger customers. But the cardholder data is anything that's personally identifiable, from the account number to the person's name, the expiration date, and the CV code on the back or the front of the card, depending on if you're an Amex holder or otherwise. Maintaining a vulnerability management program. So again, that's more or less just, you know, spot checking on a regular basis that, you know, the security and controls you have in place are actually working, right? So strong access control. Again, we mentioned, you know, having complex passwords as an example of that. You know, so many employees or so many small businesses in particular never change their passwords, right? Especially the owners of those businesses. They've had the same password for 20 years. It's their cat's name or the dog's name or some variation of their kid or grandkids' names, right? Certainly would not pass an audit. But again, they're probably falling under that 50,000 transaction threshold where they're not physically getting audited. They're just saying they're compliant. So regular monitoring and testing of the networks. Again, that's very much something that needs to be done on, you know, we recommend to bigger customers, you know, at least quarterly, that they're scanning their network for vulnerabilities. And of course, even the smallest customer should be doing that at least once a year. And then having an information security policy. So again, you know, for a small business, that can be something as simple as a one-page Word document that just has really basic security measures for their employees. You know, for example, don't write down a credit card number on a sheet of paper. Pretty common thing, happens all the time, right? Every time somebody calls you and asks you for your card number for, you know, for something, you know, you just cringe and, you know, you think, you know, they're writing that down on a sheet of paper, and of course they're going to tell you they're going to shred it, and of course they leave it sitting on the desk and it doesn't get shredded. So just a word of advice, don't ever give your credit card number out over the phone unless it's somebody you absolutely know for sure and can trust. They're not writing that down. So again, just maintaining a basic security policy for those small businesses. Of course, the larger the company, the little lengthier that security policy is going to be. So, ton of common myths out there. We've talked about these a little bit at a high level here, so let's go into them in a little bit more detail. So, the small merchants, right, who only take a handful of cards don't need to be PCI. That's absolutely not true. Now, what is true is those small businesses only fall under level 1, right? So they're self-auditing is what happens there. So self-auditing is that checkbox. So think of it like a sushi menu. They're just going down a list of paper, check, check, check. They have no idea what they're adhering to. They're just, you know, they just want to get it off their task and they go on about their business. And that's from basically 0 transactions to 50,000 transactions in a year. That is level 1, and that's self-auditing, and they still need to be compliant. They still have to answer that questionnaire once a year. But again, you know, the risk profile increases the more transactions in a given period of time a merchant actually does. But they still, everybody that accepts a card, even if they only accept a card 1 time per year, do fall under PCI. I think there's some misconceptions about PCI only applying to e-commerce companies, right? If you think about the risk there, a lot of people are concerned about giving their credit card information to an online retailer. And so, you know, obviously PCI makes a lot of sense to e-commerce. But the overwhelming majority of breaches are not e-commerce sites. They're small businesses that wrote down a credit card number somewhere, or they didn't secure their POS terminal. More times than not, it's an inside job as well. So certainly does not only apply to e-commerce companies. Organizations only have to be PCI compliant with the majority of the criteria. That's simply not true. You need to pass 100% of the 12 requirements to become compliant. Now, what happens if you don't? Simply, you have a remediation period that you need to actually solve those issues. You go through another assessment, and then you don't pass until you get to 100%. Too much time goes by in between the call it 95% and 100%. That's when they can shut you off. So certainly need to be compliant across the board, not just with. It's not a pass. It's not a get an 80% and move on to the next class, right? It's not a high school assessment test here. You got to get 100% to pass. So here we go to number 4, right? So we've talked about this a couple times already. Organizations can just say yes to everything on the self-assessment. Certainly they can, and we all know certainly they do, right? How many of us get questionnaires about some random topic and we just give it all 10s because we know that's what they want to hear on the other end, right? That especially happens when you go buy a car, for example. The sales guy's always like, can you just give me all 10s? Because that's how I get paid. The same concept applies to nearly every type of questionnaire. Unless you're really, irritated with the other person, you're just going to do what they asked. So in this case, they can do it, they do it, but that's not accurate. And that actually is considered gross negligence at that point. And that's when you can not only be shut off, but you can be fined heavily for failure. And that's mostly federal government fines, right? They will come in and do an FBI investigation, realize that, hey, you've been saying yes. That means you read the questions. That means you know what they were asking, and you simply lied. So now here's your $5 million fine. So only credit card needs to be protected, not the ATM debit cards related data. That's simply not true. A debit card is a credit card from PCI's definition. So anything that has a 15 or 16-digit number on it with a secure code and your signature on that, that is a credit card to them, whether it's a debit card or not. It can be used as a credit card, and it must be protected. So those are some really common myths. I think most of those are probably common sense for everybody on the phone, but just in case they weren't, we thought it was important to go over those. So who's responsible, right? Is it the cloud provider, such as RapidScale? Is it the company? I think you guys probably know the answer is it's somewhere in the middle, right? There's responsibilities across the board. If a cloud provider is not compliant, this does not mean its clients are. If a cloud provider's clients are compliant, this does not mean the cloud provider is, right? So there's a bunch of kind of prerequisites here. So we tried to take the eat this elephant one bite at a time, right? So we just list out the 12 requirements, and we say simply who is the responsible party. And the overwhelming majority of those, it's both, right? There's responsibility that lands on the RapidScales of the world, and there's a responsibility that lands on the client. At the end of the day, RapidScale or like service providers aren't going to be the ones to get the fines, right? It's the customer and the merchant. Certainly there's a reputation as a service provider that we at RapidScale strive to maintain, and we certainly care about our customers' data. But the riskier proposition is for the client to simply ignore the requirements of PCI and assume that any cloud provider is going to take the bulk of that risk, and that's simply just not true. So just quickly go over these 12 requirements. Install and maintain a firewall. Not rocket science here, guys. This is pretty simple stuff. But we're only responsible for the firewall that's in our cloud, right? So certainly the premise-based equipment, the responsibility falls on the client. Now, RapidScale may decide that we take on management and monitoring of that device. But again, the customer has full, admin rights to those devices, and they can simply go in and create a rule that says allow any, and, unbeknownst to us and potentially unbeknownst to their credit card customers, they're not protecting anything. So that's the key word there is maintain a firewall configuration, not just install it. Not using default passwords. Sounds pretty simple, but how many of you guys have a wireless access point in your house that you unboxed from Best Buy, you set it up, and you never changed the admin password to it? I'd be willing to bet probably 9 out of 10 people on this call have that set up today. Doesn't matter to you because you're not taking credit cards at your house, but if you roll that forward and you were starting a business tomorrow and you leased some fancy new office space and you did the exact same thing, you would not pass the PCI audit. So, guys, change your default passwords. Protecting stored cardholder data. So the reason it's both here, again, is at RapidScale we offer encrypted storage for our customers. So we do our piece to ensure that any data you do store or a client does store is protected. So, for example, if we have a hard drive that fails in our storage array and we send that off to be RMA'd, well, if anybody the chain of custody on that device is broken anywhere along the way, nobody can read the data off of it. It's encrypted. No one has the encryption keys but RapidScale employees, and therefore that data can't be stolen. Even if it's lost, it can't be stolen. The customer side, I can't protect a customer that decides they want to email a credit card number to a coworker. And that coworker gets it on their mobile device, and somebody steals their mobile phone, and now there's credit card data sitting out there in the wild. Certainly, we offer services like data leak prevention to prevent that from an email perspective. But again, it doesn't break the pen and paper rule, right? Somebody can still write that down, and it can be lost or stolen. So that's why that particular requirement lands on both the provider as well as the end user customer. The encryption of cardholder data across any open or public network. So again, at RapidScale, we offer secure VPN tunnels between our locations and the customer location. So certainly we can uphold our end of that. But again, it doesn't prevent somebody emailing it in clear text. So the customer definitely has some responsibilities there as well. Antivirus software, you would think this is a pretty common one, but how many people ignore that little pop-up on your computer that says your Norton antivirus is expired, click here and pay us $30 to renew that. Now, certainly most people don't rely on consumer-based stuff to protect their cardholder data, but if you can imagine how easily that would get ignored on a server as well, it certainly happens. So again, on servers that RapidScale manages, we offer full protection there. But a lot of our customers manage their own stuff, so that's why there's more of a cross responsibility there. Develop and maintain secure systems and applications. A lot of this comes down to customers that have their own kind of e-commerce sites on number 6. So if you think about it, you've custom written your shopping cart and your storefront and all that sort of stuff. So there's development best practices that go into play there. Most customers don't follow under number 6. That's going to be under the software as a service provider that they just buy the off-the-shelf software from. Number 7 is really around restricting that cardholder data to people inside the company that simply can be trusted, really, at the end of the day. So this is very basic security 101, right? You don't give your new hire employee that works in your mailroom access to the administrative passwords on your firewalls, for example. I know that's kind of a funny one, but at the end of the day, if you use the same password for everything in your network, then even if the guy doesn't know he has access to it, he has access to it. So it's very important to restrict any systems that have critical or personally identifiable information, such as cardholder data, to only the people that need to have those access to those systems. Number 8, I probably run into that daily, and not even just related to PCI. Just was at a customer site yesterday where they told me they had an operator account, operator 1, 2, 3, and 4 at every single office because they didn't want to have their employees to have to log in and log out of every machine every time they needed to use a particular shared machine. folks that would simply just not pass a PCI audit. Every individual needs to have their own username and their own password, complex password, that expires on a regular basis to pass the PCI audit. And that's not just PCI, that same requirement goes for HIPAA, for SOX, for FINRA, for FedRAMP, for FISMA. I mean, you name the compliance, that applies across the board. So, and the main reason there is, think about it. If you log in with user 1 and password 1234, how do I know that who that was if I've got to track that back to a breach? You know where that goes? That goes to the owner of the company, because there's no one else to blame. So certainly, as a service provider, we consult with our customers not to do that, but at the end of the day, you pay us, we're going to do what you ask us to do, and that's simply something that we just don't recommend. So restricting physical access to cardholder data, that's pretty simple. Most customers don't have anything physically with cardholder data on it other than a sheet of paper if they wrote it down. Everything's kind of in the cloud, so to speak. So that one mostly falls on the cloud providers, right? That's why you don't really see a blue box on number 9 there. That's because we're, entrusted to physically secure the data center and the assets within that data center as best as possible. And that's where most cloud providers, such as RapidScale, go through what's called SSA 16, SOC 2 compliance. And that's where we have our own, controls that are tested by third-party auditors that will protect our customers from that physical access to any cardholder data. Again, number 10 here is just monitoring and tracking access, right? So again, everything from firewall logs to badge scanners to closed-circuit TV, you need to be able to prove when a breach occurred, how did it occur. If you can't prove that, again, you have gross negligence. So any type of infrastructure or platform as a service, that's going to fall on both the customer and the provider. And of course, software as a service. So think of Salesforce.com, for example. Nobody has access to their software or their infrastructure but them. So that solely falls on them at that point. Regularly testing security systems and processes. This is where most companies, need to be doing that quarterly. And that could be as simple as paying a third party, what's called a QSA, to do a third party scan of your network and test your IDS, test your firewalls, test everything, make sure that it's set up with best practices in mind. And then internal processes and procedures, there's various ways to test that. You can simply quiz your employees. You can have them run through a quick webinar, whatever that might need to be done to test that. You just need to be able to prove that you actually documented it and tested it. And the final one is maintaining that security policy, right? Again, for the flower shop down the street, that could be just a one-pager with a couple of best practices on it that they sign when you hired them. Maybe it's printed out and posted next to the credit card terminal. Either way, you've got to have some kind of written policy that you could prove all of your employees have gone through. Bigger companies might rely on like We Comply, Thomson Reuters, companies that specialize in third-party training for security. And you can test out your employees on best practices from a security perspective. The reason that lands on the provider and the customer is the provider, as RapidScale, we must prove that we send all of our employees to security training and that they follow our policies and procedures, as well as the customer that's accepting the credit cards. So I know that was a rather lengthy explanation, but it's really, really simple if you can just break this down to your customers that, hey, PCI has 12 sections, 10 of those 12 is more of a shared responsibility. 2 of them land solely on the client. But it's really a partnership of making sure that we go through each step and address those together. I wouldn't say often these days, but in the past we would often get asked, well, what kind of customers have these requirements? These days it's almost every customer, to be honest with you. It's rare that a medical office that doesn't take credit cards, right? Those days are pretty much gone at this point. So healthcare is a big one. Healthcare and compliance in general is just big because so many various compliances fall on them. Certainly, we could have put up here, banking and finance, but that one was a little too obvious, so we didn't want to give you a too easy one there. But, banks certainly fall under this. Retail, obviously, a big one, is simply anywhere where you swipe your credit card, right? Of course, hospitality is a big one, right? Because, you check into a hotel, you go to a restaurant, a theme park, wherever you're at, your credit card is getting melted that whole time you're there, essentially, with charge after charge after charge. And they're soft storing that number the whole time you're there as well for repeat transactions. So there's just a lot of opportunity to fall out of compliance in the hospitality business. So some pretty basic conversations to have with the client, right? What kind of questions do you want to uncover with those clients? Make sure the customer knows who's responsible for PCI, right? It's not just them. It's also kind of shared with the service provider, and that there's service providers out there that specialize in making sure that they're PCI compliant and are vested in the interest of them being successful and not getting shut down for being non-compliant. Which services does a company like RapidScale offer that can help with those, right? So for all 12 of those sections, RapidScale has either a product or a service designed to meet that requirement, right? With the exception of the two that were solely on the client or the software developer for the client. And that's really a pretty industry standard there. We have a full-blown PCI document that you can give to your customers. You can find that in the partner portal, and that will address each one of these things in great detail, more than we've done here in the slide presentation. What's the scope, right? Are you at 0 to 50,000 transactions? Are you at 10 million transactions? We really need to understand what level of PCI compliance that particular customer is under, so that we understand how best to architect a solution for them. Some key tips, I think, as sales professionals, one thing that we're all challenged with is not just simply running discovery calls with our customers, but actually, leaving knowledge behind for them. So leaving some key tips for them of thinking about, security as an overall strategy, not just checking the compliance box, right? And that's everything from physical security at their premise to logical security in the cloud and everything that's in between. Especially in kind of medium-sized companies and above, it's incredibly important to name a security officer. I know that sounds maybe like overkill, but there has to be somebody designated as the security person, whether or not they're an expert or not. Few people on this planet are security experts at this point. Security is probably the most complex, evolving subject there is in technology, and so all I would say here is you just need to have an internal resources that's dedicated for those annual or quarterly assessments that can at least be the go-to person to coordinate the calls between vendors and suppliers and everyone else that is helping achieve the company maintain compliance, right? Certainly a risk-based approach, right? This is, I think, where many customers say, you know what, I did a risk assessment, I'm just going to check the box because I can't afford to spend all the money on security. And certainly there's going to be customers out there that do that. But I think it's your job as sales professionals to make sure the customer understands the real risk, right? They can be put out of business, right? If not put out of business, they're going to severely impact their revenues and their kind of outwardly known perceptions of their company. Of course, at RapidScale, we'd love for customers to make security part of their DNA. Fortunately for us, most customers don't, and that's why we kind of come in and help them with that. But if not part of the DNA, at least understand the importance of it and be on board with protecting the data as best as possible. So we always like to end these webinars with a real live customer use case. We think it's helpful. This was a 2016 opportunity that we closed. Customer had about 22, 23 locations. Think of a traditional retail, 2, 3, POS terminals, accepting credit cards throughout the day. They were coming up on a PCI audit. They really were overwhelmed. Very light IT. They had one help desk person, a couple of IT project managers, and a VP that was in charge of IT. At the end of the day, they had no real engineers or real security professionals on staff. They didn't know if data was leaking. They didn't know if their data was encrypted. They didn't even know what to expect with a PCI audit. So a couple of things we did was we converted their point-of-sale terminals to thin clients and implemented virtual desktop as a service solution. And what that's able to do is it actually removed their remote locations from being even in scope of PCI because no data was being stored locally in those stores. The data was being transmitted directly to our data center. And so they could simply, as long as they could prove that their employees went through their security training and they locked the doors at night, they didn't have to go through a full network audit at every location. We implemented data leak prevention on top of their email. So for example, if an employee decided to foolishly email a credit card number, the data leak prevention algorithm would strip that number out of the email automatically and replace it with all X's. So it protects the company, protects the employee from getting fired, it protects the service provider from leaking that information. Just in general, it's a best practice. And of course, we provided our platform by default is encrypted storage, and we provided that to the customer where they didn't have that in place today. And so, we believe we exceeded their needs because they didn't initially come to us as a PCI opportunity. They came to us as, hey, we just need help with IT. We migrated 20 servers and 500 desktops to the cloud. We completely removed their locations from PCI scope. We implemented security on top of all of their systems, and we helped them with their PCI audit at the end of the day. Very happy customer, and they saved hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and all sorts of different things. And that ended up being about a $56,000 a month opportunity. So as a sales partner, you may not necessarily be out there prospecting for PCI customers, but PCI came up in this discussion in the initial discovery meeting with this client, and we were prepared to address it. And we want you as sales partners to be aware that we have expertise in this field. So I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Our wonderful marketing team has been collecting questions, so we will we'll pause now for questions.
They've all been currently answered, so let me see if any come in really fast here.
All right.
Okay, here's one. Please go over implementing Mimecast UEM and DLP again.
Sure. So Mimecast is a software as a service company that most of the major cloud providers partner with these days for adding on what's called unified email management on top of mail, right? So at RapidScale, we offer Cloud Mail, which is hosted Exchange. We also offer Office 365. Either service we can implement Mimecast on top of. The way Mimecast works is the customer's mail actually hits their servers first, whether that's inbound or outbound. They scan it for viruses, filter it for spam. They archive it optionally if the customer pays for archiving. And then they send it on to wherever the Exchange server actually sits, whether that's RapidScale's Exchange servers or Microsoft's Exchange servers or some other provider's Exchange servers. The data leak prevention is actually an algorithm that runs on their servers that can be configured. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, you can add different criteria to that. By default, it's turned on, and it will automatically strip out things like social security numbers, credit card numbers, and anything else that you program it to strip out. Again, it's just based on a very basic, what's called a regular expression. And it's all done through a web portal. And essentially it protects that customer from really hurting themselves. So even if, Johnny sitting in cube, 1 sends an email to Sally sitting right next to him in cube 2, if implemented properly, that message doesn't just get delivered right next door. It actually gets sent to Mimecast first. Mimecast sees that, hey, Johnny made a mistake and put a credit card number in the email, replaces it with X's, and then forwards it on to Sally sitting right next to him. So the positive news there is it's dummy proof. So hopefully that answers the question there.
All right, we don't have any more at the moment. Let's see. I think we're good, Dwayne.
Okay. Well, just housekeeping, guys. Thanks for joining. We're very happy that you took 45 minutes or so out of your day to join us this month for the technical webinar. The next one we're pretty excited about as well. So we're relaunching an SMB-focused cloud desktop service that kind of reduces that minimum. A lot of the cloud desktop providers, including RapidScale, prefer to sell 50 users and up to make it economically deliverable for the customer as well as management-wise for us. But we have a multi-tenant cloud desktop solution we're affectionately calling Cloud Office 2.0 that we're relaunching on May 1st for new customers. And Mark Sotkowski, our wonderful president of sales here at RapidScale, will be giving a sales-related presentation on May 3rd at 9 Pacific time, noon Eastern. And, hopefully you guys can join us for that as well. We're pretty excited about this. It's been about 6 months in the making here at RapidScale, so we hope that we can address the kind of sub-50 user cloud desktop customers. So thanks again for joining us. Any other questions you guys have, feel free to email your channel manager or marketing, and we will get back to you.